So, for those of you who've attended some of these previous sessions, the logic of these sessions has been to provide risk practitioners with some guidance beyond the sort of vanilla of, what is ISO 31000 or what does a risk process look like? Some of those elements have been pulled into the conversations, but this is largely to try and add a little bit more meat on the bone for the likes of yourselves. And as Ian alluded to, the session that was hosted last week was really good to give you insights into the things that are not always apparent in the roles we undertake, and how to promote ourselves, and obviously what's happening in the industry. So I'm hoping that this is a bit of a segue on from that and then continuing that conversation. So what I want to really pick up on today is the fact that when we are in a risk organization, the tendency is to think that what we're doing in one area is exactly the same as it's doing in another area, but that can differ quite dramatically. So hopefully some of those insights that I share today will be of use to you in that regard. So what I really wanted to kick off with is this concept of when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And this is an illustration of a woman by the name of Karen Byrne. And the reason why it's an illustration, not a photograph or something more personal, will become apparent in what I have to say. But she suffered from severe epilepsy, and then at the age of 27, she had a lobotomy. And essentially what they did is the doctors went in and separated the corpus callosum. And you might be thinking, what the hell's this got to do with risk? But essentially what ended up happening is the procedure was successful, but it left her with a condition called alien hand syndrome. And what she would do is her left hand would beat her up. The left hand would undo anything that the right hand was doing. So if she wanted to light a cigarette, the left hand would put it out. If she was dressing herself with her right hand, the left hand would undo the clothing, and vice versa. And it led me to think something that I'd heard at a presentation a couple of weeks ago out of Australia, where the presenter said the risk practice is almost like the organization's nervous system. It goes to all parts of the organization. It tells us when we can proceed with something, when we need to pull away from something. But largely, if the rest of the organization doesn't know what we're doing, we can end up being quite disconnected from the purpose. And so it really helps if we understand what we're doing so that we can convey that message into the organization. So today what I'll be doing is trying to unpack on that. And if you're wondering what that stems from, it really comes down to what do we do as risk practitioners? When I got into this discipline, this would cover most of what you're doing. There might have been a slight difference between qualitative and quantitative risk, but largely you followed the risk process. You were focusing on controls. You're doing risk assessments and facilitating those kind of conversations. If you trawl through job descriptions of current people in the risk practitioner position, you will see that all these things start to come out quite strongly. You need to either be proficient in a modeling language such as Python. You need to have an idea of either being able to do some underwriting or actuarial competency, right through to ESG, health and safety, be more interested in the compliance angle than in the risk angle, and then know tools, such as Jira and Confluence. So you have this wide range of responsibilities, to the extent that in the last couple of weeks while I've been preparing for this presentation, I've even seen that job descriptions saying that you don't have to have any expertise in risk, which is almost completely against them.
Ross, are you sharing your screen? We can't see a presentation.
Okay, well, let me try that again. Should be shared, but I'll go back. That probably doesn't help much. How about now?
It's great, thank you.
Okay, well, awesome. It's nothing like talking to somebody and not realizing that nobody can hear it. But anyway, so let me just press on to a couple of these slides that I was trying to emphasize the point, where risk practitioners focused on all these other elements historically, and now you've had a strong influence of quite diverse requirements, from various risk themes that might be quite specialized to compliance requirements, particularly the sort of things we've spoken about previously in terms of CPS 230, whether there's general compliance requirements, to more actuarial and modeling type capabilities. So no longer are we just focusing on the vanilla risk. And as I said, quite intriguing to see that we even have job descriptions in the market where you going for a risk role and it tells you that you don't have to have any expertise in risk. So it's quite a different space from when I got into this, and I've been doing this for a while. And so I'm hoping that some of these insights will be of benefit to you in your role and how you want to shape your career in the space. So the things that I'm going to pick up on today are the competencies. Now, there's quite a number of them listed, and you can look at them in more detail, but I'll try and give you some sense of what we're expected to be doing in the space. Then probably the bulk of the conversation will be focused on how does the organization or contextual factors in the organization influence what you're doing. And then lastly, just, how do you show up as a risk practitioner? What would be the best way to proceed? So what I mean by competencies, so largely competencies come down to technical and behavioral elements. And the technical things are what you can do, and they're probably more the harder skill set, whereas the behavioral side is the softer side of things. So what do we mean by that? So technically, it's what do we do in this role as a risk practitioner? And it can range, as obviously those earlier slides were trying to allude to the specifics of a risk process, and that there's some more specifics. But regardless of that, you're really trying to provide things across these competencies. So analysis and insights, so an ability to collect information in the organization, a degree of thinking around that and analyzing that, the ability to get other people on board to what you're doing. So you need to have a way of engaging and upskilling the organization. There's the vanilla or the basic risk practitioner role around performing the risk management function. So this is where you are collecting and getting an idea of what the profile is, and then being there to challenge and provide oversight. And as I've said, these slides will be available to you, so you can drill down into the specifics if needs be. You need to be performing, ensuring that there's an improvement to performance. I mean, we often talk around risk being perceived as the handbrake or resistance to getting things done. We need to make sure that what we're doing is integrated into the planning, the performance, and the reporting, so the organization benefits from what we do. We need to be refining the frameworks that are required in our organization. Ian alluded to the fact that the need to build the fit for purpose solution and not just sort of cookie cut and superimpose things that are available in the public domain, even if they are a starting point to work with. Managing stakeholders across the business, and particularly being able to mentor and partner with the business, particularly those in first line that need that support. And then, you've got to have a good grasp of what's going on in the organization, because one organization can be quite different from another. And if you just apply a standard approach, it may not serve the needs of the organization you find yourself in. So that's the sort of the more technical oriented competencies. From a behavioral perspective, this is the softer skills, the how do we do risk management. Things that you need to be able to do is, be able to support the organizational objectives. You can quickly determine that there's a very nuanced separation in these definitions between technical and behavioral. They're not always completely separate, but what you will gauge from this is, how do you do these things? How do you improve the ways of working? How do you use evidence in the organization to support the need to manage risk, the support to report? How do you support people to make effective decisions? You need to be able to share the vision of the organization and provide some leadership in that regard, despite your location in the hierarchy. You need to be very persuasive in your language. Quite often you are needing to glean information from the organization to provide reporting or persuade them to implement compliance or risk control. So you do need to have a means of getting people on board and not just going headlong and trying to get those changes to take place. Collaboration, obviously that's stating the obvious. You can't do these things in isolation, and any work that's easier to do in isolation will be the worse for it, because you need to definitely have the organization engaged in what you're doing. You need to be able to develop yourself and those around you, particularly in the teams. Attention to detail. Quite often, if you're doing anything of a quantitative nature, we can't err on the side of not providing that level of precision. We need to take decisions. We've always got to think about the customer, and what we mean about that is obviously our internal customers in the organization as well as external customers. So a lot of the compliance work that we will be doing will be cognizant of those requirements in the, at our end customer and our end stakeholder. And then obviously, time management and planning skills. So that's an overview of the vanilla competencies that you'd have from a hard and a soft perspective. And as I said, when you get the slide deck, you can drill down into these to get some more specifics if needs be. And you may want to try and get them from your organization, find out how you're being engaged, because obviously this is the standard, but there'll be levels of expertise as you climb the ladder and as you become more proficient in these skills. So now we're going to move on to what I really want to sort of give the bulk of attention to, and this is really the influence of organizational factors on your role. And I developed a sort of a risk posture matrix, which I've used in some conversations in organizations that I've worked in. And it really sort of goes along these lines, that if we have two different variables, the first one being this sort of movement or this between risk and compliance, risk on the one side and governance and compliance on the other side, where a lot of your risk decisions are based on a continuum, whereas your binary ones are more, your governance and compliance ones are more binary. You're either compliant or you're not. There's not always a gray area. We can also find that we can have organizations that can be more strategic in nature versus operational, and that can either be at an organizational level or at an operational level within the body of the business. And in this instance, the strategic ones are obviously far more focused on trying to create value, and the operational ones are more around the protection of value. And obviously somewhere in the middle, we have a balanced view. And most often you'll find that your organization is a combination of these factors. But what it helps you to do is, if we sort of work around this in a clockwise manner, if we had an organization or a team that's quite strategically oriented with a strong focus on governance and compliance, in many instances, the positive there is they're like the poster child. They are striving to provide value in the organization. They're making sure that there's no right and wrong. Everything is very clear to them. It's also the kind of approach that tends to be quite exhaustive. You want to have a risk taxonomy and a control taxonomy that covers everything, and that's fantastic in terms of how you want to address things, but it's obviously has the downside in that it's quite onerous and burdensome to cover off all aspects. And it does mean that if you don't cover everything off, people are left looking for that guidance. So it strives around command and control, and that is probably beneficial in some organizations, but it can be a detractor if you're not too sure how to apply your thinking from a risk practitioner perspective. If we move down to the more operational side of that graph, what you tend to see is that the approach is unambiguous. It's quite precise in what it needs to be, but again, it has its pros and cons. It can be very consistent and rule-based. Again, that can have its pros and cons, but one of the detractors in this area is it tends to be quite tick box oriented. We might have done everything that we need to do that is of a compliance and governance perspective, but we're not necessarily catering for all aspects of the risk sort of decision framework. So as we start moving more into that risk decision thinking, we now start seeing that if we are still quite compliant, we sort of playing it safe. We're doing what we need to do that's more risk oriented, but we're still quite safe in our thinking. And we now need to start catering for very diverse needs. So what's needed in technology is different from what we need in health and safety, et cetera, et cetera. We are quite case specific in our needs, but again, one of the downsides is that we don't always have ways to integrate that information, and it takes a lot more effort, particularly if you have a leaner risk team. For some people, this can lead to analysis paralysis, where we're so heavily focused on all these different requirements within our own domains that we miss the wood for the trees, despite trying to provide the most effective decisions we can. which leads me to what we'd obviously want to strive for is this sort of strategic risk decision space where every now and again we need to consider our compliance requirements, but a strategic mindset where we're looking at the value creation and we're looking at this continuum of options will allow us to be more resilient, because we will be faced with things that range from day to day, and we are positioned to respond accordingly. We allow for a more integrated approach, and that is easier said than done. The organizations I've worked in where we've strived for this kind of model, we do run into issues where the integration is easier said than done, even though we're trying to accommodate for everyone's needs. And obviously one of the downsides is this is the space where you're potentially sailing quite close to the wind, and maybe you can fall foul of not being compliant and whatever the ramifications around that. So this is just a theoretical idea of understanding what kind of team or what kind of organization you're in, because if you're trying to be very adventurous and look at a diverse range of options of how to do risk when you're in a more compliant and more command and control organization, you can find that being quite restrictive in what you'd like to do. It can feel a bit uncomfortable, and the same applies the other way around. If you've come out of a very compliance oriented heavily regulated industry and you move into something that's less regulated, you may find a degree of discomfort in not being able to operate in that sort of more those continuums as opposed to the binary decision making. So that's something to just factor into where you find yourself and what you need to do as a risk practitioner. The next one is really around the size and the maturity of the organization you're in. So I've worked in organizations where they are listed entities, and the only risk practitioner they have might be a health and safety officer and a loss adjuster who's looking at closed circuit cameras at some of their operations. I've also worked in some of the financial services industries in New Zealand where I remember once attending a workshop where there were over 400 people in the organization who had some degree of risk and compliance in what they're doing. So you can understand it can range quite dramatically. And so if I can try and capture that in an image, it's really, you're either going to find yourself in an organization where there are very few practitioners and they either have to take on many roles, or they just exclude certain roles and only do very select roles. And having operated in that capacity, I know how difficult it can be, because if you are adopting best practices from other industries, you're going to find yourself very restricted in being able to implement that, and you need to cherry pick what's going to be most effective. On the other side, in the sort of the larger organizations, you will come across many practitioners, and I just used that example in financial services. And what that means is you are expected to stick to quite distinct roles. And what I found quite interesting when I've worked in those kind of organizations, I can deal with someone who has a very, very narrow understanding of what they're doing, or of the bigger picture, and they do their role very well. But if it's not integrated, it's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So I would encourage anyone who finds themselves in a big organization with a big team with a lot of specialist risk roles to see how your work links up, so that you can demonstrate your value and obviously create opportunities for yourself to move within the organization. So that's the size aspect. When we look at the maturity, this is a diagram I've used in one of the previous conversations, but what tends to happen in many organizations as we mature, we start off where we have the risk function really being the one who's responsible for the heroics. They are burdened with a lot of reporting. They are trying to do many things, and this can encourage you to sort of generate a risk register in your own office and not necessarily go and consult with everyone in the business. It can have you just take a very sort of shallow view of the organization, which is not necessarily a fair reflection of what's going on. And it may not appear that you're doing more than just ticking the boxes and being compliant. This is a really hard space to operate in, particularly if you're trying to encourage the organization to mature. But as you start transitioning through to the other levels of maturity, particularly if they are driven through the likes of, this is where compliance becomes a good bow wave to to draw the organization into better risk practices. You will now have to work more closely with line one, and it'll range from being sort of dragging them, kicking and screaming, to coaxing them, to partnering and guiding them. And slowly, as you move in that direction, you'll be having to hand over the actual sort of risk responsibilities, particularly the risk management responsibilities, to them. And consequently, your role will be to keep them honest, to be chasing them regularly, realizing that their view and your interests may differ. So it takes a lot of work until you get to an area where you're working a lot more collaboratively, and then right up at the most mature end, where risk management is almost become second nature to the organization. I mean, I've heard it repeatedly, and it probably is quite cliched, is that you want to be so good at, as the risk practitioner, you want to be so good at educating the organization on risk management that your role becomes, unnecessary, and you sort of disappear. And I don't think you ever will have that happen, but the tendency is that you go from risk management being almost invisible to being very prominent to almost being invisible again, where it's so integral, and the risk practitioner themselves is not as obvious in the organization as one would like to think. Then we talk around where you are in the organization, and the first instance is really this horizontal location. So I've already alluded to it, but it's this: are you in first line, are you in second line, and or are you in third line? So obviously first line, the operational side of things, you're heavily focused on the identification, the analysis, and the mitigation of those risks. You also should be playing a key role in the monitoring of what you're doing and the reporting of what you're doing, and then building awareness within your teams, particularly if you are the line one risk person or the risk champion. Otherwise, you will then it then becomes very hard for you to carry this burden. So that's where you want to focus if you are in a line one capacity. If you're in line two, obviously this is where, to a large degree, you manage the framework, the artifacts that make up the risk framework across the organization, from the policy all the way through. But where you will start to add value is where you are either able to add expert advice. So this is obviously where you might see, IT risk or health and safety risk or privacy, whatever the case may be. You are the expert within the organization, and you're guiding line one in what they needing to do. Or if you are of a more generic risk practitioner role, this is where you're providing oversight that everything's been done correctly. You're there to evaluate if what's being done is satisfactory, and then also challenging what people are doing so that they don't get into a tendency of sort of being their own judge, jury, and hangman. And that's, I think, the bulk of us in risk management will play a role in line two, but there are many organizations I've been in where you will play a role across all three elements, where you're needing to do assurance at some instance. Maybe it's not in internal audit or independent assurance, but you will play a role across all of those. And when it is more ring-fenced as an internal audit function, this is where they will provide assurance of line one, assurance of line two, and then assessing the overall maturity of the organization. For those of you who might not be aware, if you're ever dealing with the big four, typically this is the route in. You would have been requested by the board or the audit and risk committee to engage one of the auditing firms, and you come in via internal audit, and then to a certain extent will penetrate into line two and line one. It varies, but typically that's the route in for consultants. They will come in that route, and consequently what can happen is they may have bypassed the executive and senior management, and as a result there may be some resistance. So you are doing work that's not necessarily at the request of your direct manager. It's come from higher levels within the organization. So it's useful to bear that in mind. Then there's this key question that always gets asked is, are you there? Is your role risk management? Is your role the management of risk? And without trying to sound like that's a semantic exercise, the risk management is largely around the content and around the process, sorry, and the management of risk is around the content. So what does it mean? So typically, if someone says I'm doing risk management, they may be working on either putting together the framework, they may looking at how to integrate reporting and monitoring, putting the systems in place, analyzing the data, etc., or they could be drilling down into the content themselves. And that's typically where a lot of the work within Line 1 is done. They're the ones that are focusing on each one of these aspects, unless they are a cross-cutting risk. And so you either find yourself in one area or the other, or working across those areas. But it's useful to know that you can be in the position where you have put together the framework, rolled it out in the organization, and then not necessarily be respected for your input on a specific risk, because the belief might be is you don't necessarily understand the business, you stick to doing frameworks and policies, etc. So as a practitioner, it is incredibly useful for you to understand those distinctions. And if there are specific areas, so maybe you are a risk partner, so you're sitting in line 2, serving a part of line 1, where you need to understand that portion of the business really well. We had a conversation last week at the presentation that RIMS hosted, where the underlying messaging, particularly from, that had come via recruiters or come from other people, the guests or the experts that shared their insights, is you have to understand that your role must add value to the business. First and foremost, that's who you're serving. So no matter where you find yourself on this continuum, you need to understand what you're catering for. It can't be purely in service of risk. It needs to be in service of the organization. So we've looked at where you might be located horizontally, but then there's also the vertical aspect. And for those of you who may or may not be aware, there's often a big distinction made between whether you're working in enterprise risk or operational risk. And so what do we mean by enterprise risk? That's typically something that, you get in that top-down view of the organization. What does that entail? Well, this is obviously where a lot of the risk is taken. And what I mean by that is this is where the decision makers are influencing strategy. Where do we want to operate? How do we want to operate? What does our business model look like? You are taking the risk at that level. You're looking at both value creation and value protection. You typically have a more strategic, outcomes-focused view, as well as being holistically considering the whole organization. You also want to make sure that anything you're doing needs to get centralized and made consistent so that you can make more informed decisions. And this is obviously also the area where risk appetite within the organization is set and can cascade it down into the organization. When you are in a more operational risk management role, you're creating the bottom-up view. And what that entails is this is where you control risk. And so you'll find that you're quite often primarily involved in protecting value and less so in creating value, but that's not to say that it won't exist in this area. You're more focused on outputs than on the outcome side of things. You have a far more sort of reductionistic view. You are centering on your area of concern and not necessarily how all the pieces fit together. And this is obviously when you're looking at the domain, so where you are in terms of a functional risk type within the organization. And because of that, you can find that your approach to risk management can be quite varied and decentralized. And as I mentioned earlier, we then have that challenge of how do we integrate it together to provide the valuable insights, feeding it up. And you are then managing risk within your areas according to appetite. So if you look at this sort of distinction, you will find that if you're trying to progress in any direction in the risk world, if you're still in operations, understand your domain and what you can do, or if you are in enterprise space, understand what you are and where you can apply value. But it's really key for when you transition from, let's say, from operational to enterprise risk, because you now need to cater for a different suite of solutions and cater for a different set of stakeholders and be better positioned around the integration. You need to take a higher level view. You need to be more forward thinking. It can be quite a challenge. And so to any of you that are out there in the market trying to find different roles, bear in mind that there is quite a distinction between the two. And obviously, within some organizations, there isn't any distinction, or they don't label it as such, and you will be sort of found wanting because you're not quite sure what they require or what they request. So if you're sitting in line 2, the influence of how you do risk management is really quite impacted by who your boss is or who your boss's boss is. And the reason why I say that is, in my experience over the years that I've worked in risk, I've had different sort of reporting lines that have been quite influential on how I do things. And so what I wanted to do is call up this diagram, but I understand that it's not going to be legible, the left-hand side. This is work that was done by the Risk Leadership Network. And they were looking at, if you took a range of risk roles, so down the left-hand side, we've got Chief Risk Officer, Director of Risk, Director of Risk and Compliance, Director of Risk and Audit, etc., all the way down, and you map them to their reporting lines, you can see that this can range either from direct line of reporting to the CEO, or into finance, so the Chief Financial Officer, or into strategy, or into assurance, or into legal, and in some instances, even corporate services. And what is quite intriguing is that you can understand that if you report into a CFO, questions around money and the financial viability or the cost of controls will come up more often than not, whereas when you are reporting to legal, whether it be the general counsel or head of legal, you'll get a lot more questions around compliance and a stronger focus around privacy, etc. So it's useful to know who you're reporting to. What I found quite interesting is that while the assurance angle obviously caters for the Audit and Risk Committee, if you are in a risk function and you are reporting to an operation, a part of the business as opposed to part of the governance level, you can understand how your focus can be quite different in terms of almost an after the fact view. You're assuring what's being done correctly as opposed to a more strategic view. My last observation from this, which I found quite telling, is that I've worked in organizations where risk actually reports to a technical function. So it's more engineering oriented than it is of the sort of the traditional corporate offices of finance and legal. So bear that in mind whenever you find yourself in a risk role or you're moving from one risk role to another, because the way you approach things can change quite dramatically if you move from reporting to general counsel to reporting to the CFO. Then we get to, how do you show up as a risk practitioner? And I'm getting towards the sort of the latter end of the presentation now. And obviously there's a lot more specific requirements in various organizations. And you will find, I'm sure most of you, when you get into a risk role, one day can be quite different from another day. If anything's happened, if legislation has come through where we need to put in new compliance requirements, either locally or coming through from, the likes of APRA in Australia, or as we've seen around sort of climate risk, where there are diverse requirements around the world, you can find that the way you are approaching risk can differ from day to day. And the more resilient you are in your personal capacity to navigate that, the better placed you'll be to respond. And so you'll have an understanding of what you need to do. So I'm just sort of going to conclude today's presentation with a couple of slides here. And I know it's earlier than normal, but what I wanted to indicate is there are a couple key decisions I really think that you as a risk practitioner need to take when you're thinking about the bigger ambit. The first one is this: have you chosen to be in a risk career, or is risk a stepping stone for you? And one of the comments made last week was, is it a ladder or a playground? So you may find yourself being your heart set on getting in at a sort of an advisor or an executive level and working your way all the way up to senior manager, head of, general manager, whatever the case may be. Bearing in mind that, I mentioned that financial institution where there was almost 400 people that were in a sort of a risk capacity. They are all channeling up to the same sort of pinch point. So you might find that you are progressing through the roles and then will find it incredibly challenging to get into that position. And also bearing in mind that some of those institutions gain a lot of benefit from cycling people through from other parts of the business. They could be more in a customer facing role, but they're expected to come through a risk role. So while that's trying to show sort of 4 channels going up, quite often it tapers quite dramatically. In the sort of the playground or the lattice, you can move around. So you can move into risk and out of risk. You can move into compliance and out of compliance. But I think if you have a sense of what you're trying to do and how this all fits together, you can become far more effective in navigating your career within risk. The next question to ask is, are you a specialist or a generalist? So if I had to think of myself, I consider myself an expert generalist. I've done specializations in a number of risk fields, but my tendency is I want to try and link up many different roles in the risk sphere and have that even integrate into things like strategy or business improvement. You, on the other hand, may decide, look, using Malcolm Gladwell's outliers, I want to do 10,000 hours just in compliance, and that's the way I believe I'm going to sort of make headway. Understand that these different roles can differ for organizations, understand how those factors that I've described earlier can be influential on that, but always keep that in mind, because I think we tend to see more and more examples of quite specific roles coming up. But generally what I've seen balloons, you're lucky. What I've seen from time to time is that as the economy seems to sort of slow down slightly, there's a tendency to go the generalist route. As it picks up, we go specialization route, particularly if there's anything around compliance. So bear those distinct options in mind. And then if I can conclude with the following slide, is just really, I've obviously managed people over the years, and quite often you might have someone who is quite flamboyant and wants to do a lot of things in the business, and they might be really good at socializing and getting involved in some of the committees within the organization and social clubs, etc. And what I try to encourage them to do is to always come back to the basics and going, are you covering off the basics to begin with? And what are the basics when you look at it from a risk practitioner? Well, I think these are the key things you want to try and do. You want to be managing uncertainty where it exists. You want to be enabling better decisions, and you want to be contributing to better outcomes. Those, I think, if you can say you're doing that on a day-to-day basis, I think you can say that you perform in your risk role well. The requirements that you need to have in place into tackling those are the suite of the following. So managing the framework. So either you as the risk manager that needs to put some of those artifacts together and use them in the business, or as the person managing risk where you are utilizing those tools. You need to be providing meaningful analysis and insights, and you need to be building the capacity of those who are your partners in the business, those who are the partners in your team, and ensuring that the culture that you want to inculcate in your business is being developed appropriately. And then lastly, that you're undertaking the necessary stakeholder management and have an understanding of the environment in which you operate. And I think if you can cover off each one of those and use that almost as a checklist for yourself, I believe you should be able to navigate in any role within as a risk practitioner, knowing full well that things can change on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to leave it there for today.